great to see everybody gathering together again for another GRIP-Birkman Coaches Cafe, as we're going to talk today about not just discerning, but cooperatively, collaboratively discerning God's will and how we do that as a group. I'm excited about the dialogue that we can have today, and some of the folks that are on this conversation today will have some deep insights, I'm sure, about this, as we have had many conversations in the past about what it means to work together in the body of Christ, and finding the mind of Christ is something of what we're trying to do here. How do we discover the mind of Christ as a body? And we're trying to determine what it is that he is calling us to do, not just individually, but thinking about a corporate calling that we might have as a team, as a group, as an organization. So I'm really, really excited about it. Jen Burnham is the one who wrote this article for us. Jen is a change management consultant, leads a team of people working with Providence Health Systems in Portland, Oregon. And she has done just a fantastic job of writing this article that we shared in the newsletter. And you can find the article, those of you that are perhaps watching the recording, you can find the article on the website when you go to resources and look down into those resources that are there for coaches. It will show up someplace like, you can even just put GRIP-Birkman.com/discerning, and you can find the article that we're talking about here right now. So some things that popped out at me as I was reading the article, thinking about how the norm for many people is not what is described in this article. Keeping that in mind, that saying from observation that typically conversations get clouded with positional power, preconceived ideas, ego, but cooperatively discerning God's will for a team is vital because we exist on this planet to steward the time, relationships, spiritual gifts, and talent he has provided for us for his glory. And then that 1 Peter 4:10-11 to administer the gift that God has given to us, whether it's gifts of the word or gifts of action. So talk to me, guys, about how you see that thing of how vital it is because of the stewardship principle. And how does that play out for you and what you've observed as teams are working together?
Years ago, Larry, there was a regional leader in our area that had said to leaders, everyone who has joined your team or has been incorporated in your team is a precious resource that was God's, that's been handed to you to steward. And so you must cherish it and cherish them. And those words have just hung with me for 20 plus years now. And that if I'm going to work in team with somebody, then I need to always be asking myself, am I truly cherishing them? Do I prayerfully consider my stewardship of what they bring to the team? And that's always been kind of my pause. I kind of have to remind myself if I'm entering a difficult team member or teaming situation to go, wait a second, remember whose they are, they're not mine, and remember their value. And those are those kind of checks to help me move forward.
Good word, Shannon.
I remember working with a team years ago. Some of you may have heard me talk about this. Pastor and his leadership team in a team building, and as we were using GRIP-Birkman and getting into the dialogue, the first break we took after about an hour and a half of the very first meeting, he said, "This is just fantastic. I already know 2 people I need to fire." And I thought I would have a heart attack. It was like right off the bat, if that's his mindset, and spent the rest of the 2.5 days, every break we had almost, I almost neglected the other people, spending so much time with Trim, trying to coach him into seeing that these are people that God has brought to you for you to mentor, to develop. And if maybe some of them are not in the right position, you can help them find the right position. But just starting right off the bat with that attitude of, you making this decision unilaterally and you're just going to fire these people. But exactly what you said, Shannon, helping him to try and see God brought this team together and you have a stewardship responsibility to make it work. You can't just be complaining about what you don't have or who you need to get rid of. How do you help them to be productive for the kingdom while they're here with you in this time? Yeah. Wayne, I see you. Go ahead. Yeah. What was that, Wes?
I have a question about your illustration there. Was he looking at people who were on the same page he was?
I think these were people that many times gave him pushback on some of the decisions that he might make. And from my perspective, he needed some of that pushback. And one of those was a young guy, youth pastor. I guess it's okay to go ahead and identify it that way. He was a youth pastor. And, he was young and could have used a little bit of guidance, a little bit of encouragement. But, he was wanting to launch out and do some creative kinds of things that might not have been what the pastor wanted. But when had the pastor ever communicated to him what he did want? Or, how did they need to perhaps get together to determine what this guy's next plan was going to be, what his next steps were going to be? So they might have been a little bit out of step with what he wanted, but what was he doing to get them in step was my question. And sometimes it might have just been pushback that he needed to hear. We shouldn't, if we all always agree, sometimes that might mean something's out of whack. Sometimes, it's not really that we both agree, it's that one person just doesn't want to speak up.
Yeah, I had a similar experience to the one you described, going through a team build, and the pastor said, I have somebody that no longer needs to be part of the team. And, I pressed him, and it wasn't so much what he was, it was how he thought, because he was kind of, as you're describing, he's not going in the same place. And my response was, if we're all the same, some of us might not be needed, because there's no challenge there, no team. He was just looking for little clones. That's why I asked the question, is that I wasn't able to help the pastor. He didn't want to hear what I said.
Yeah. And that comes back to that whole concept of, one strong man leader. And, each of those words is key to that concept. It's one, it is the strong, and it is a man who is the leader. And when we have that limited concept of leadership, as opposed to what Jen puts here, understanding our calling, and with that in bold print in the article, understanding our calling is the skill necessary to set course together in ministry. If we're going to be the body of Christ growing together, we need to think in terms not just of each individual's calling, but of our calling as a team. Here we are as a group. And how do we discern that together? Thinking through, I'm just kind of glancing through the rest of the article to kind of get a few things. When she talked about the creativity, that we do have to have some creativity on the team, but sometimes can't that creativity lead to friction as well? All right, I see you guys grinning about that, thinking about some cases. Give us some illustrations.
First of all, I agree with everything, Larry, you said as far as, the example you gave. I'm glad I wasn't on his team. But there's a lot of assumption in saying that God brought us all here. Part of that assumption is we were all listening to God, and not there's a statement out there, some author, somebody smarter than I wrote, that said, we tend to, many times we tend to create God in our own image and then use that image to create us. And so I think part of the job of a leader and a new leader coming into an organization is to really discern and help the team discern, is it truly God's will for them to be there? And in your case, this guy wasn't even wanting to try to do that. And then if it's not, then I think it's the job of, if someone isn't a fit, then it's the job of that leader to help that person find a fit wherever that might be. But to think that, especially with new leadership coming in, that everybody's going to be a fit is probably not. It could be true, but not necessarily true. So I think you have to be careful of that, and in the area of leadership, how do I help everybody discern that? How do we help people see that? Yeah. And not just make that assumption, because I've actually worked in an organization that the new exec coming in made the pledge, no one's going to lose their job, and he was trying to restructure and put the organization in a new direction, and it never happened because he wasn't willing to make the hard decisions on who would stay and who wouldn't stay. And I think that organization is in worse shape today than it was. It's just going downhill because that same idea permeates. Sometimes if you're moving a new direction, it's going to take new people to go that direction. And I'm not an advocate of just wholesale, like you were saying, this guy was wanting to do, these are the people I need to fire. No. How do I help them understand where they might need to go? And maybe it's even a different place in this organization, but so I think we need to be careful on that. As far as tension, healthy teams actually will have tension.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So unhealthy teams, you can tell the health of a team by whether or not there's tension. If everybody's just going along, getting along to go along, or going along to get along, however that phrase goes, then it's probably not very healthy. So part of the health of a team is there tension, and how do they work through that tension? So yeah, there needs to be tension. And when I'm working with teams, whether I'm on the team or consulting with the team, if there's not tension, sometimes I'll just try to create it just to get people moving.
Oh yeah.
Because you don't discover new stuff without tension. Growth doesn't happen without tension. So
I got interested in balance theory a few years ago, and the idea that nothing changes unless something is knocked out of balance. You have to create. If you have too much equilibrium, then you don't grow. So you have to create disequilibrium at some point, so that someone will want something to change, and therefore then you can grow. So the interesting thing to think about there. And if the team is being creative together, then a new idea is going to come up, and a lot of times a new idea hits me at first negatively, and I think, wait a minute, whoa, what are you talking about there, And it takes a while for it to sink in. And so, yeah, but we talk through it, and we might need to refine it or whatever, and come up with an even better idea because the whole team is putting into it, right? But I agree with you, Wayne, there has to be some kind of tension in there, but we want it to be healthy tension. We don't want it to grow to conflict. We want it to be, you can have some disagreements, we can have some dialogue. There can be a little bit of stress because of changes that are happening, and making sure that takes place in a healthy way.
Yeah. Well, and I would even say conflict is not, because conflict, the definition I use of conflict is two people trying to occupy the same space with different, with different agendas. And so if you have conflict, how do you work through the conflict?
Right. Yeah.
how do you work through the conflict? A great book. I was trained by this guy years ago. And Larry, you might have seen it being Southern Baptist stuff, but Pat McMillan, a book called The Performance Factor on creating high performance teams. And it's just some genius stuff. There it is.
There you go, Shannon.
Yeah, man.
It is amazing how we think alike so many times, don't we? Yeah. Shannon, talk to us more about that whole thing of creativity and also the idea of responsibility and the impact that all of that has then on us.
I was looking at that sense of responsibility and realizing that it's sometimes hard to fully entrust something to another person on the team. And, but I've been having to learn that. I've got some new persons I work with, and they work in some disciplines that I have a little bit of understanding of, but not a great deal. And to let go and just say, you're smarter, you have more expertise, and you've got this. It was very difficult at first, but as I've seen them excel and stepping up and being responsible, it's like amazing how much more freedom I have to say, I don't need to worry about that. I just ask them for a brief. And if they say it's good to go, it's good to go. If they have input, I listen to it. It's quite liberating, but I'll admit it was not me a few years ago. I would have just held on to it and asked for their help if I really felt I needed it. But learning to let go and let other people grab the responsibility and trust them that they've got it was hard. It's been hard, but rewarding.
Just say one of the things that really impressed me about that too, and I think we've touched on it in different ways here. She focuses on an understanding that self-centeredness stops us from understanding God's corporate will or our will together.
Yeah.
That just intrigued me. That stopped me as I was reading the article. In our culture, we think of understanding God's will, or we think of we've talked about this before, leadership as being very focused on an individual. And so the question is, how do we corporately, how do we as a group discern God's will? How do we not allow our fears to just simply let one person just lead and we become sheep? And that's just a really, I think at least in our Western culture, that's a really difficult concept for us to understand. And it stopped me when I thought, hold it. So if I'm in a group and I am allowing somebody else to say, I think this is God's will, we need to move forward without my input, I've never seen that as self-centeredness. In my part, I've seen that as submission. And I think what she pushes back here is to say, no, you're afraid that maybe somebody will disagree with you. Maybe you don't have the ear of God. It was just a fascinating concept for me to kind of digest that. And every once in a while when you're reading through something just stops you, right? And you go, shoot, I need to read this paragraph again and again. And I'd just be interested to know as a group, where does that grab you to as understanding this corporate decision making, corporate seeking God's will, not individually seeking God's will?
Is one of our problems, Ken, that we don't see the team or the group as a one, that we as a unit? Is that our first stumbling block?
I think that's a good insight. It shapes, here we are as a leadership team working to move from I to we, right? That's kind of our goal, to understand the we aspect of it. And so Les, I think that's a good insight, that we have to step back even in the way we think about the group. Wayne, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the dangers is, and I've really dealt with this last 2 years. This last Sunday, I just finished up a 21-month intentional interim in a church, which ended up basically being a restart. And our whole goal for 21 months was to understand what is the Spirit of God saying to this church. That was the question that we sought to answer for 21 months, which really, it really pressed in on me, because, working with elders and then working with the navigation, and really focusing on that. That was a hard, this article just jumped out at me because a lot of it, because of that. And I think one of the dangers is we are very too free, I think, sometimes to say, well, I think God's will is, or God's will is. And I'm kind of pushed back from that a little bit. Sometimes that statement is said and everybody in the room will go, oh yes. Because if it's God's will, if everybody is listening to God and something is God's will, then everybody in the room is going to agree with that statement. And I think that I'm cautious to use that phrase. Well, God's will is, because because what that does is it sets it up as if anybody disagrees with that, they're disagreeing with God.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And I am not, even as the pastor of this intentional interim for 20, I'm not the only one in the room that's listening to God. So I think part of the thing that needs to change is our language on how, when we're leading a team, facilitate. I like the idea of the phrase facilitating a team rather than leading a team.
Yeah.
The language we use is so important to how that invites other people into the conversation.
Speaking of that, Wayne, inviting other people into the conversation, I don't think that we put enough value on corporate prayer.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about inviting the Holy Spirit to come to this meeting, for example. We ask him to come, and we don't necessarily approach it from the standpoint of we are already in his presence, that this is his meeting and he should be guiding it. And how
Mm-hmm.
do we determine the will of God? Forgive me for using some of these illustrations from my past. This is one of the things that happens when you get to be the oldest person in the room, guys. We were, as a young minister, I was on a strategic planning committee for an association where we knew there was going to be tremendous growth. This was just outside of Dallas, Texas. And we knew tremendous growth was coming our way to this association of churches. And we were gathering together and putting together different committees for strategic planning. And we were trying to make a very long range plan looking toward the next 20 years. And the leader of the group said, okay, we got to have this committee, we got to have this committee. But the very first committee he said was the prayer committee. We need a prayer committee, and we need some people to be focusing on our prayer strategy. And nobody volunteered for that group. Here we are with all these pastors and staff people of other churches, and nobody volunteers to be on the prayer group. And, he really started berating us for it. And finally, I spoke up as probably the youngest person in the room. And I said, well, Pastor, we're probably thinking that prayer ought to permeate everything that we're doing on every committee, and, not to just have one committee thinking about prayer. I was just assuming that everybody would be praying. And he said, yeah, man, that's the problem. We're assuming prayer, and we cannot assume prayer. We need to put prayer at the top of our strategic list. And boy, did that stuck with me to the extent even now, my son, Brian, almost every meeting that we are ever in, when he is up speaking before the church, says, like I always say, prayer is not part of our strategy. Prayer is our strategy. And he doesn't know it, but a lot of that came from way back when. As we think in terms of how do we really seek the mind of Christ, we're really seeking asking him to speak to us. And after an extended period of time, that doesn't just mean 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, but an extended period of time, as we were really and truly all praying and pouring, not just pouring out our hearts to God, but asking him to pour his heart into us, to then rise up and say, hey, does anybody have a word from the Lord? Does anybody feel like, God's saying something to you? What is it that God might be saying to you right now? And pursuing that. And when that happens, Wayne, I have seen it happen where someone says, guys, I just have this sense that God is telling us to do this. And someone else says, I had the exact same sense. And I can't tell you how many times I have experienced that when we have gotten our priorities straight that way.
The key with that is that often that sense in a group, at least in my experience, isn't the sense of the leader.
And it isn't necessarily the leader who's the one that first picks up, is it, Ken?
Yeah. And so what happens is the leader has to be humble enough to say, that wasn't the direction I thought we were going. And but you know what? I sense the value of the Spirit's working here, and I'm willing to step away from my self-centeredness and actually be meek and say, if this is where God's leading us, yes.
Hey, another thing Jen mentioned too, or Shannon, were you about to add something to that?
Well, it raised a question in my mind, which is in facilitating a group or being a part of a group, how can that group, or even the person who may have the responsibility of providing some leadership, how do you create that atmosphere which allows everyone to know I can voice, and when I do sense I sense something, and I believe it's from the Lord, to have that confidence to speak up. What are some tips on just setting the tone for that to happen, where people are at ease and they're welcome to, they know that they're welcome to interject or to speak up. Because I frankly, I've been to too many meetings where everyone looks around and goes, I think we're really just here to be quiet and nod when it's appropriate. But how do you overcome that hurdle to truly get this? I understand the principles, I mean the philosophy, but what are some practical steps to create that environment that you or others have used?
Now that's a hard one. And I think it does. To be real honest, I think it comes down to brokenness. If I'm being successful on my own, then I'm going to continue on this path. But if I have been broken and realize that, hey, it's not this wonderful thing that I am giving to God and he's so grateful to get it from me, and that sounds extremely arrogant, but I think that is the attitude sometimes that we demonstrate. But instead I come with this attitude of brokenness. And that list of reflective questions that Jim provided for us toward the end of the article, I think is really, really key. Before showing up to the team meetings, doing a spiritual examination of myself, Lord, how is my heart right now before I go into that meeting? Do I have a sense of humble submission to God and to my other team members? Are there some thought patterns that I need to be working on here? She goes through that list. Have you prayerfully discerned what God has placed inside of you? And are you considering how that impacts other people? Are you open-handed with the wisdom God provides in response to your team? Or do you self-monitor to be sure you're taking time to hear the perspective and wisdom of others? Are you leaning into God's cooperative calling of your team or ministry? And how are you responding with new believers as a result of a new direction? Hey, sometimes it's the new young person on the team, that we need to listen to because they've got a whole different perspective. So and then she goes through that thing as leaders about monitoring your own walk, ensuring that your own spiritual house is in order. And going on through the rest of those things in that list. I think those evaluative kinds of questions, those reflective questions could be a really, really important thing for us to look at.
Hey, Shannon. When I don't know, it sounded like you were asking, like, very practically speaking. and I think it's interesting how as I'm listening to this conversation, I think about the different committees and groups that I'm in, and some of them I am obviously head over, like the campus ministry that I work at, right? The leadership team is under my direction and stuff. And so I am thinking about the conversations that I have outside of the meetings that are very fruitful for in trying to empower people before they get into the group setting to be able to share those things that they feel God is putting on their heart. And I've noticed that about our camp president, the Ponderosa Christian Camp president. He does that as well. He makes a lot of phone calls the week before just to say, hey, what are you thinking about this situation? And then he'll ask me to bring it up in the conversation, and he supports it. And when they see him doing that, I think it's pretty powerful. But I hadn't even realized that until this conversation. That really stuck out at me. But I think about the times where I do ask our leadership team ahead of time to be prayerfully considering and send me recommendations, send me things that ideas that they might want to do for this, facet of our ministry or whatever, and then trying to affirm those as best I can privately and then publicly in the corporate meeting. It seems to me to have a pretty good impact on allowing them to feel like, hey, I have a part in this. So I don't know, that's what came to mind as you were asking those questions.
Hey, that's really good. What Hoover said about creating that culture in the chat, and then Garrett, what you just said, it's ruminating in my mind, and I'm thinking through situations where I've seen that done, and it's like, yeah, that it prepared people. They knew they were welcome before we even got together because they'd already been asked or had already been included. So yeah, it's a really great reminder. Thank you.
Another thing I think about is when we are doing team builds and how we try to coach a leader to be vulnerable. And for some leaders that I have worked with, I think it's the very first time they have really been vulnerable with their team when they are sharing their assessments and what they're learning about themselves. And they open up and then affirm other people. And in that time of affirmation that we always try to have in every team build that we do, that time of affirmation is really setting the pace for this. But how do you teach a leader to be humble and vulnerable is I think part of what you're asking there, Shannon, and I don't have an answer for that, except for the thing of, yeah, Les, what else were you thinking there?
I think there's a couple of behaviors that a leader can model or make use of, like stop talking. As long as the leader's talking, there is not going to be conversation. And sometimes we don't ask questions. We just look for verification of our opinion. So, I could begin by saying, okay, guys, let's talk about why blue carpet is the best choice. That's not opening a conversation. I'm just looking for somebody to verify that, I've got the right decision there. And so, as coaches, we should be mastering the skill of asking those open-ended questions where it invites other people's opinions. And then when we stop talking and just wait, we're giving that opportunity for others to respond. And one of the things, and I was guilty of this for the longest time until one of my coaches pointed out, is when I answered right answer, well, that was the end of the conversation. Because there could be no other right answer. And so, my coach suggested, saying things like, okay, what else? What other ideas? What other options? But if you put an exclamation point at the end of one answer, you've precluded no others. So those are just some behaviors that we can practice and encourage others to use, and that helps open up conversation. It acknowledges that we, not just me, is in charge here of the conversation.
Yeah, Hoover, good to see you, brother.
Good to see you all. Has anybody read Tripp's book on lead? Have you guys seen it?
Paul Tripp.
Yeah, Paul Tripp's book on leadership in the church.
Oh, yeah.
It's outstanding. I've given away 6 copies of the book to various leaders. But it talks about leadership not as a individual, but leadership as a corporate body, and the work of leading work as a leadership team. I think he's thinking in terms of elder boards and those sorts of things, but but to the article's point that it is a corporate thing. There's a lot of thoughts here in regards to why. Certainly humility is one of the critical factors that we're seeing in leaders. If anybody's listening to the Mars Hill the podcast on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, there's a lot of leadership lessons there of what not to do as a leader. But one of the pieces that I'm doing quite a bit of work in here at our church, and then also I'm teaching a leadership class, co-teaching it with a colleague, is the area of self-awareness and feedback, and it's not just instruments like the GRIP-Birkman, but also receiving feedback well. And so a book that we're working with leaders on is the book Thanks for the Feedback, which is outstanding, and that's been helpful. So anyways, those are Shannon, you were asking in terms of practicalities, and getting to humility for leadership. One great way to measure humility is how does that leader handle feedback, whether it's positive or negative, and how do they respond to that? I think that's an excellent measure.
I think in terms of some of the scriptural bases that we would be looking at for some of this, like out of Philippians 1, 9 and 10, it's my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and with all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. The thing of, true love that we express in the body of Christ. And of course, love means putting the other person before ourselves. Later on, Paul says, down in chapter 2, that we ought to have the same mind that's in Christ, and then do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Those are, when you get right down to it, that's a pretty big pill to swallow, isn't it? And in our Western society, especially if we're thinking about democratically governed bodies, we think about one person, one vote. And so I get to stand up and I get to express my opinion. I remember one time, again, as a young, cocky, arrogant fella, we were in a business meeting, and this one brother stood up and he said, well, in my opinion, and I just said, brother, I'm not interested in your opinion. I'm trying to find out what's the opinion of God here right now. I don't care what each individual's opinion is, because we could get your proposal and then his proposal, and we can vote against the two. Which one do we like the best? And what people are really doing is they're either voting for you or they're voting for him. And already we're divided as soon as we start to vote that way. So instead, I'd like to say, let's just find the one thing that God is trying to tell us here. How do we find that? And I didn't handle it the right way. It was really arrogant of me, the way that I addressed that fellow. I had to go back and apologize. But he said, no, but you're right. How do we find the mind of Christ? And that is what we're looking for. And how do we change our language even to reflect that? Well, what else jumped out at you about the article or anything else in this whole subject of trying to find discernment, finding wisdom corporately, collaboratively as a group? Anything else jump out at you?
I was on the first page, or as you're scrolling there, it's right above where it says impact of cooperative discernment. That last sentence, understanding our calling is the we skill necessary to set the course in ministry. I don't know too many ministries that started with a we. There's usually a point person, a pastor, the guy in charge, the lady whose idea it was, and then we go from there. We almost set ourselves up for failure when that's the model we have on the table. And, you know, aside from Jesus launching church through a group of guys and gals that he discipled, that shouldn't happen again. And so I've just been kind of stuck there, just rolling that idea around. How do we get away from that model?
Yeah, and she preceded that with those who take part in establishing a vision will be more likely to buy into it and commit to share that vision. So in order to make the most of the teams we assemble, it's imperative that we learn how to cooperatively discern his will. If we're all together working on that, then we all have buy-in, right?
I mean, a number of years ago, a couple decades ago, I was dropped in a foreign city, nowhere near my denomination's headquarters, and said, plant a church. You know, and I was dropped there with a teenage daughter, with all the baggage that a teenage daughter brings, and my wife. And we were dropped behind enemy lines. And the model that the denomination had intended for us was for me to lead a movement to create a church. And what I chose to do instead, because I had no idea what I was doing, is I gathered some people who knew Jesus, and we decided what a church in that community might look like, and we chased after it. Now, the end result was church, but it didn't look like the one I was set to plant.
Oh.
But don't we set ourselves up for failure when our model is a person leads this thing? And how do we change that if it is?
Yeah, and in Birkman language, expectations that we have of how things are supposed to be. And so we get in our mind how we think it's supposed to be. And then when it's not the way we think it's supposed to be, we get all distressed about it. And, everything gets out of whack, right? But again, it's because of our individual, personal, perhaps even selfish conception of the way things ought to be. Our preconception. And it sounds like what you folks did really was, taking a good tack on that, Les, of together, let's discern what God's will is for us and what kind of church we're supposed to be.
I had an interesting conversation yesterday. Just your comment reminded me of this. Just a young guy talking about ministry, but I just happened to ask him, so what are you learning these days? It's always kind of an interesting question. What are you learning these days? And when you get a blank response, that usually tells you something. But this guy said something interesting. He said, I'm learning that that things that frustrate me almost always come out of my own expectations. So every time I'm frustrated, I'm saying, what did I expect to happen? And why then what was the basis of my expectation? And he said the number of times that we find ourselves having to back off and say, you know what, I set up an expectation that was not realistic. Therefore, that's why I'm now upset and unhappy. And I was thinking in terms of this article that we're looking at too, how often do we as leaders do that even with the team? I come in, I know what we want to accomplish. I know what I expect. Les, you touched on that, I know what the church ought to look like. I know what the result is. And then if things don't go the way we expect, we either push them to make it go the way we expect, or we become disappointed or whatever. And this is forcing us to kind of step back and take a whole different look at seeking God's will in as a team, really moving from I to we. And I think it's going to take some rethinking in our minds about how we do that. Go ahead, Les.
Yeah, I've been slowly working my way through David Fitch's book, The Church of Us versus Them. And, if the other is not I or we often see them as the enemy, the competition. And I've been pondering that in my I'm new in my community. Most of you know that, or some of you know that. I've recently come to this church. And, I sit in ministerial meetings and I feel like I'm the new competition. They're trying to figure me out because I'm leading a church that's in the same neighborhood they are. And that's not the reality. The reality is we're all players on this same much larger team. And, as we're looking for the will of God for my community, our community, it can't be me versus them. It has to be us. We have to come together. And so this conversation is so apropos for where I'm finding myself right now, trying to figure out how do I enmesh myself into this group of men, they're all men, trying to figure out how to get the larger share of the community that's interested in Jesus inside their building, rather than coming together. How can we get the most number of people in the community interested in Jesus? That's two radically different things. Am I serving the kingdom, or am I trying to grow my church? Which, by the way, I've never found that verse in the Bible that says that's my job, grow my church. I'm supposed to be serving his kingdom, which means I'm not the leader. I'm one of the team players. And so this conversation overlapping Fitch's book, which just really gets in your face when you start thinking about how do I see these other players on this same team? That's a problem for us, because we're already setting ourselves up for conflict and not a team. Is that making sense?
Oh, yeah. In fact, you make me think about one last thing I want to throw out here. Jen talked about fear and pride, and how those can interrupt the unity of the group as we're trying to collaboratively discern God's will. Phil Hodges in Lead Like Jesus talked about ego, and how ego is edging God out, and because I am at the center of everything in my ego. And the two sides of that ego coin are fear and pride. Fear and pride are two sides of the same thing. They're both related to ego. I'm either building myself up, but I might even be building myself up because I am afraid of failure, or I'm afraid of what other people will think, or I'm afraid of what my image is going to be. I'm afraid of my future and how this is going to affect all kinds of things that we might be afraid of that relate to our ego. And of course, the opposite of that would be humility, love. That would then be, as Phil puts it, exalting God only. That now becomes my ego, where Christ replaces my ego as the center, and he becomes the center. And when we can get to that stage of learning to exalt God only, then we can fight that ego thing of fear and pride, because no longer do I have to worry about, did my plan succeed or not, because it really was God's plan that I was trying to pursue, that we were all trying to pursue. And learning that concept then of working together collaboratively as a group. Yeah, that's a huge challenge, isn't it? Any other thoughts about that with the whole concept of fear and pride?
Yeah, I'd like to just quick comment is, I think it's a critical question to ask a leader to ask themselves is, what am I afraid of? Because is it because I'm going to lose position or lose, we don't have the concept of face as much in the West, but certainly pride becomes a critical aspect of face, and it exists much more in our culture than we realize. And so, as a leader, if we are in tune with ourselves and understanding what's happening internally, in our hearts, and as we are praying, I think it's a critical question for us to ask. Am I afraid of loss of position, loss of face, loss of my idea or whatever? And I think something I learned from Susan is so much of our lives are driven by fear, and so and how the fear train operates. So.
2 Timothy 1:7, where we've been given a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. That was our memory verse for our church this past month. We have a pastor who's working on our biblical literacy and teaching us to memorize verses as a congregation. And in every service, we repeat whatever this month's memory verse is that we're working on. And that was it for the month of September. And I think that's a good one for us to end with here. That how do we battle that? Well, remembering that we've been given a spirit of love, power, and self-control. And how do we use that? How do we steward those relationships? How do we steward that power of the Spirit working in us? And how do we maybe sometimes exhibit some self-control when we might want to do things in the flesh, right? Well, folks, we've come to the top of another hour. We could go on and on, I think, with this discussion, but it has been great to be with you again. Thank you for your participation. I think we all have been stimulated by this. Thank you, Jen, for a great article. We'll look forward to another one. We're going to follow this pattern for the next 5 months or so, guys, as we're looking at more body life values that we're going to be examining together in this cafe. So we hope to see you again next month, same time, same channel, same place, same cup, but new coffee. And meanwhile, keep plugging away at it, guys, to build unity in the body of Christ so we can see more people coming to know Jesus. Bye now.